The woman in the emerald dress held one of my pendants up to the chandelier and said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Delia, these are extraordinary. I had no idea you made all of this yourself." My sister smiled the smile she saves for cameras and said, "Every single one. It takes over me, honestly. I lose whole nights to it." I was standing 4 feet away with a glass of warm, sparkling water I did not want. And I felt the floor tilt very softly under my shoes because I knew that pendant. I knew the exact weight of it, the way the silver had fought me at the bezel. The tiny flaw near the clasp that only I would ever notice. I had made it in February at 2 in the morning with a burn on my thumb, and my sister had just called it hers. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what she did, because the two things are the same story. My name is Marin, and I am a silversmith. Not a jewelry seller, not a hobbyist with a bead kit, though my family has called me both for years. I cut and forge and solder metal into things people wear against their skin for the rest of their lives. I have a small studio at the back of my apartment, a bench with a leather apron nailed under it to catch filings, a torch, a rolling mill I bought secondhand and rebuilt myself. I have blackened fingernails most weeks. And for 11 years, I have pressed a single hidden mark into every piece I finish, in a place no wearer ever looks, because a real maker signs her work. The mark is small. It is a stylized letter, my own initial, curled into the shape of a tiny anvil, cut into a steel stamp I made by hand when I was 24 and could not afford to buy one. I tap it into the metal in a hidden spot, under the bail, of a pendant, inside the curve of a ring shank, on the back of an earring post where it meets the ear wire. You would need a loop and a reason to find it. Most people never do. But it is there on every finished piece, without exception, for 11 years. And beside my bench sits a plain leather notebook, worn soft at the corners, where each piece gets a line, a number, a date, the metal, the stone, if there is one, and where it went. My ledger. I never thought either of those small habits would matter to anyone but me. Delia is 3 years younger than me and has always been the bright one, in the way families decide these things early and never revisit them. She is warm in a room. She remembers names. She can make a stranger feel like the most interesting person alive for 90 seconds, and then move on. And the stranger will talk about her for a week. When we were girls, she borrowed my things, my sweaters, my books, my good pens, and she borrowed them so charmingly that returning them felt like my responsibility, not hers. I used to find my own belongings in her room and quietly take them back, and somehow I was the one who felt like a thief. That pattern is the whole thing, really. I just did not understand for a long time how far she would take it. It started, I think, about 2 years ago, though I only see the shape of it now. Delia would come to my studio to relax, she said, to watch me work. And she would pick up finished pieces from the tray by the window and turn them over in her hands and say how lucky I was to have a little talent to play with. Sometimes she asked to borrow a necklace for an event. I always said yes. Why would I not? She's my sister. She would post a photo the next morning, glowing, and I would smile at my phone, glad she liked it. What I did not notice was that fewer and fewer of those pieces came home. A borrowed necklace became a lost necklace, became a shrug and an, "Oh, I think it's in a drawer somewhere." I told myself I was being petty for keeping count. So I stopped keeping count. That was my mistake. The first real clue came in the spring, and I did not recognize it as a clue at all. A message arrived in my shop inbox from a woman named Priya, who had bought nothing from me, ever. She wrote, very politely, "This might be strange, but I bought a silver pendant from a designer named Delia at a craft market." And when I took it to be resized, I noticed a tiny letter stamped. Inside, almost like an M with a little shape under it. "My jeweler said it looked like a maker's mark. I found your work online, and yours looks similar. Do you two work together? I read it 3 times. I remember I was standing in my kitchen, and the tea went cold in my hand." I typed back something vague and friendly. "We're sisters, so there's a family." Resemblance in the style, and I told myself it was nothing. A craft market, a pendant, a coincidence. I did not want it to be anything, so I made it nothing. That night, after Priya's message, I did one thing I had been avoiding. I went to my studio drawer, the wide, flat one where finished pieces wait, for their clients, and I opened it and looked, really looked for the first time in months. The garnet ring was not there. The hammered studs were not there. A pair of moonstone drops I had made in December were not there. I stood over that drawer with the lamp buzzing above my bench, and I told myself a dozen soft stories. A client had picked them up. I had moved them. I was tired and miscounting. But I am a woman who writes everything down. I crossed to my ledger, and I checked, and the ledger said those pieces had never been collected. They had simply gone, and only one person came to my studio to relax. But it saddened me, the way a splinter sits under the skin before it turns. A craft market. Delia had never mentioned selling anything at a craft market. Delia, who found my work sweet, who called it my little hobby at dinner. While she talked about her real career in event styling, why would she be at a craft market with silver pendants that had my mark inside them? I did not go looking for the answer. Not then. I want to be honest about that. I was afraid of the answer, so I let it lie. I went back to my bench, and I made a pair of earrings for a bride in another state, and I stamped them. And I wrote them in the ledger, number by number, the way I always do. And I did not think about my sister for whole days at a time. The wound underneath all of this is older than the jewelry. In my family, my hands have always been treated as a cute accident. My mother, when she introduces me, says, "Marin does jewelry. It keeps her busy." In the same tone you might use for a woman who does puzzles. When I sold my first serious commission, a memorial ring with a man's fingerprint pressed into the gold, for a widow who cried when she put it on, my father asked if I had thought about getting a real position somewhere, with benefits. I stopped bringing my work to family dinners. I stopped explaining what a bezel was, or why hand forging takes 6 times longer than casting, or why my prices were what they were. It was easier to be the sister with the hobby than to keep defending a life they had already decided was small. There was a dinner about a month before the party that I keep returning to, because it was the last time I let myself be made small without a word. We were all at my parents' table, and Delia was telling everyone about a creative project she had been pouring herself into, being mysterious about it, letting them coax details out of her. My father beamed. My mother said Delia had always had an artist's soul. And then, as if it were nothing, my mother turned to me and said, "Marin, you should ask Delia for tips. She's really finding her gift." I looked at my sister across the roast chicken, and she looked back at me with a small, private smile. And I understand now that she was not nervous at all. She was enjoying it, She knew exactly what her creative project was. It was me. I said nothing at that dinner. I passed the potatoes. I have replayed that silence many times, and I do not entirely forgive it, but I understand it. When a whole family has spent years agreeing on who you are, the quiet one, the hobby one, the one with a little talent that keeps her busy, it takes enormous force to break the agreement, and I did not have it yet. So I ate my dinner, and I drove home, and I sat at my bench past midnight, forging a bracelet for a stranger who would love it. Pressing my mark into the silver where no one would ever see, telling the metal the truth because I could not yet tell the table. That bracelet, number 431, is the last piece I made before the party. I still have it. I wear it when I need to remember. So when Delia's engagement was announced and my mother called me glowing to say, Delia was going to have the most beautiful party, and darling, she's even going to display some of her design work. Isn't that wonderful? I felt only a dull, tired confusion. Her design work. Delia styles events. She arranges flowers and chooses linens and picks a color story. She had never, to my knowledge, made a single object with her hands in her life. But I was not going to be the bitter older sister who questioned it. I bought a card, I bought a gift, I put on a decent dress, and I drove across the city to a rented loft with exposed brick and hanging bulbs. And I walked in, already exhausted from smiling, and that is where the woman in the emerald dress was holding my February pendant up to the light. Let me describe the room, because I have gone over it 100 times since. Warm light everywhere. Those Edison bulbs on black cords, the kind Delia loves. A long table with champagne and small food on slate boards. Peonies, of course. Pale pink, her signature. And near the window, on a low table draped in dark green velvet, a display. Little stands and busts, and a folded easel card in Delia's handwriting that said, in gold ink, designs by Delia, handmade with love. And on the velvet, catching every bulb in the room, were maybe 15 pieces of jewelry. Rings, pendants, a cuff bracelet, 2 pairs of earrings. Every single one of them was mine. Not similar to mine. Mine. Made by my hands, at my bench, stamped with my mark, written in my ledger by number and date. I did not make a sound. I want you to understand that. I stood at the edge of that party and I looked at 11 years of my life laid out on green velvet under my sister's name. And I did not scream or cry or knock the table over, though every cell in my body wanted to. Something colder than anger arrived instead, a kind of terrible clarity, because I was already counting. The cuff I made in October for a client who canceled. The garnet ring that had gone missing from a drawer somewhere. The little hammered studs I thought I had simply misplaced. The pendant Priya's message should have warned me about. The one with the M inside. This was not one borrowed necklace she forgot to return. This was a system. This had been happening quietly, piece by piece, for a very long time, right under my smiling face. I let myself drift along the edge of the display, close enough to hear what people said. A young woman was trying on the cuff, sliding it over her wrist, saying, "Delia, you have to make me one. I'll pay whatever." Delia laughed and said she was so backed up with commissions. I nearly laughed out loud, a terrible laugh I had to swallow, because I knew where every one of those commissions had come from. My drawer, my bench, my hands, my ledger. An older man asked her how long a piece like the pendant took to make. Delia said airily, "Oh, days. You lose track." The silver tells you when it's ready. That is a thing makers actually say. And I felt a chill hearing it in her mouth, because it meant she had listened to me say it at some point and filed it away to use. She had not stolen only my objects. She had learned to wear my language like borrowed jewelry. The strangest part was how much I understood the room's mistake. Delia looked exactly like what people expect an artist to look like. Luminous, effortless, surrounded. And I looked exactly like what people expect a tired woman at a party to look like. Watchful, plain. Standing near the flowers, with a drink she was not drinking. If you had walked in and been asked to guess which sister had spent 11 years alone at a bench, burning her thumbs on hot metal, you would have guessed her, not me. That is the whole cruelty of it, and it is not really about jewelry at all. The world hands the credit to the person who performs the story best, not the person who lived it. I had let that happen for years by staying quiet. Tonight, the difference was that I had finally started counting out loud, if only inside my own head. A man near me picked up the garnet ring and said to his wife, "This is real craftsmanship." "You don't see this anymore," his wife said. "Delia's so gifted. Where does she even find the time?" And I opened my mouth and then closed it again, because who was I in that room? I was the sister with the hobby. I had no display, no easel card in gold ink, no crowd calling me gifted. If I had walked to that table and said out loud, "These are mine. I made every one," I would have been the jealous one. The one who could not let her little sister have a nice night. I knew exactly how the story would be told at every future dinner. So I said nothing, and I moved through the party like a ghost at my own robbery. And I waited, though I did not yet know what I was waiting for. What I was waiting for turned out to be a woman named Ruth Aldermere. I noticed her because she moved differently than everyone else in the room. She was older, maybe 60, in a beautifully cut gray suit with no jewelry at all, except a single unusual brooch. And she was not drinking, and she was not chatting. She was standing at the velvet table with a pair of my earrings held up close to her face, turning them slowly. And she was frowning in a way that was not disapproval, but concentration. She had the stillness of someone who knows exactly what she is looking at. I found out later that Ruth owns a small, serious gallery downtown. The kind that represents 4 or 5 makers at a time and sells their work to collectors who fly in for it. She had come as a guest of a guest. She had come, in other words, entirely by accident. And she had found my work. I watched Delia notice her. Delia has radar for the most important person in any room, and she crossed to Ruth within 2 minutes, champagne in hand, warmth turned all the way up. "You have a good eye," Delia said. "That's one of my favorites." The stones were a nightmare to set. I heard her say it. The stones were a nightmare to set. Those earrings have no set stones. They are hammered silver domes, forged, not cast. There are no stones in them at all. Ruth's eyes flicked up to my sister's face for just a moment, and something in her expression cooled by 1 degree. And then she smiled a professional smile and said, "They're lovely." "You made these yourself?" And Delia said, "Every piece here. I do it all by hand." And Ruth said, "How wonderful. I'd love to talk to you about your work." I should have felt despair, watching my sister charm a real gallery owner with my earrings. Instead, I felt the cold clarity sharpen into something almost like hope, because I had noticed what Ruth noticed. Ruth had asked a specific question, and Delia had given a specific false answer, and Ruth had caught it. I did not know yet how much Ruth had caught. I drifted closer, pretending to look at the peonies, close enough to hear. Ruth was asking Delia the questions any serious buyer asks a maker, and I realized, listening, that these questions were a language Delia did not speak. Ruth asked what gauge she preferred for the ear wires. Delia laughed and said, "Oh, whatever looks right." Ruth asked whether she fabricated or cast the cuff. Delia said, "A bit of both, depending on my mood." You cannot cast that cuff a bit. It is forged from a single bar. There is no both. Ruth set the earrings down gently on the velvet and picked up the garnet ring, and she turned it over. And she looked at the inside of the shank for a long moment, and then she looked up at Delia with a mild, pleasant expression that I would not have wanted turned on me. "You know," Ruth said, "your pieces are quite accomplished, genuinely. Which is why I want to ask you properly." She let a small pause open. "Do you keep a maker's ledger? For prominence. If I'm going to show work in my gallery, I need to be able to document each piece, when it was made, the materials, the mark. Any maker working at this level keeps one." "May I see yours?" And the whole warm room seemed to lean in very slightly, and my sister's smile stayed on her face, but her eyes went somewhere I recognized from childhood. The look of a girl who has been asked to return something she cannot return. "A ledger," Delia repeated. "Of course. I mean, I keep everything on my phone, mostly. Photos and things." Ruth nodded kindly, the way you nod at someone you have already stopped believing. "Photos are lovely for marketing," she said, "but provenance is different. A maker's ledger, a maker's mark. Do your pieces carry a mark?" Most serious silversmiths sign their work somewhere, a hidden stamp, usually. Yours would be where? And Delia, who had never once looked at the inside of the pieces she was selling, who did not know the mark was there, who could not have described it if her whole future depended on it, and it rather did, said the thing that finished her. She said, "I don't really do marks. I like the work to speak for itself. It feels more pure that way." And I watched Ruth Aldermere understand everything. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment the whole story turns on, and it turned not with a shout, but with a question. Ruth did not accuse anyone. She simply picked up the garnet ring again and said quite gently, so gently, that only the few of us near the table could hear, "That's interesting, because this one is marked. Right here inside the shank, there's a small stamp, a letter with a little anvil under it. Someone signed this piece." And she held it out, not to Delia, but flat, on her palm, to the small circle of people who had gathered, so that anyone could look. And a silence opened up in that corner of the party that was different from all the happy noise around it. A silence with weight. And Delia's champagne glass came down onto the velvet table with a small, careful click, because her hand was no longer entirely steady. That was the moment I could have stayed a ghost. I could have let the silence do its work and slipped out the door, and never said a word. And it would have been a kind of justice, watching my sister fail to answer. But I did not want a silence to expose her. I wanted the truth to stand up in the light and be counted, because I had spent 11 years being told my truth was a hobby, and I was tired of being quiet in rooms. So I stepped forward, and I heard my own voice come out level and clear, which surprised me. "May I said to Ruth, and I held out my hand, and she looked at me with real curiosity and placed the garnet ring on my palm. And I turned it, and I found the mark I had pressed into it with my own steel stamp, and I said to the whole small circle, "It's an M. With an anvil. It's mine. I made this ring." Delia laughed, or tried to. "Marin," she said, in the warm, indulgent voice she uses to make me small in front of others. "Please, this is my party." "You do lovely little things too, of course, but there's no need to—" "I made this ring in July," I said, over her, still level. "Garnet, sterling silver, forged shank. I made the earrings you said had stones. They don't have stones. I made the cuff you said you cast. It can't be cast. I made every single piece on this table." My mother had appeared at the edge of the group now, her face doing something complicated, and I did not stop. "And I can prove it," I said, "because I do keep a ledger. I've kept one for 11 years. Every piece I've ever finished has a number and a date and a line in my book. And every piece carries that mark in a place the wearer never sees, because a real maker signs her work," Ruth Aldermere said, very quietly. "Do you have the ledger with you?" And here is the small, strange grace of that night. I did. Not because I suspected anything. I want to be clear. I walked into that party knowing nothing. But my ledger lives in my bag. It has lived in my bag for years. Because I never know when I will finish a repair at a client's home or agree to a commission over coffee. And I write everything down the moment it happens, or I lose it. So it was there, at the bottom of my bag, under my keys, soft-cornered and ink-stained. I took it out. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had been all night. Because at last, I was holding the one thing in that room that could not charm anyone and could not lie. Numbers do not care whose party it is. I opened it on the velvet table, right beside the display, and I did not perform it. I simply turned to the pages and read. "This ring is number 419, I said, finding the line. "July 9th. Here." And I laid the open book flat so anyone could bend down and read my handwriting next to the ring, the number, the date, the little note I had made about the stone being slightly included. Then I found the earrings, number 402. Then the cuff, number 388, October, forged from a single bar. And beside that entry, a line that said, "Client canceled. Kept in studio." Kept in studio. The cuff my sister had taken from my drawer. Piece by piece, I read them out, and piece by piece, I turned each one over and showed the mark, the same small M and anvil, matching the number in the book, and nobody said a word, because there was nothing left to say. It was Priya's message that I thought of, standing there. The stranger who had written to me in the spring, the woman with the resized pendant and the little letter inside it, the clue I had been too afraid to follow. She had seen the truth months before I let myself see it. If I had followed it then, I might have confronted Delia in private, and Delia would have cried and charmed and reframed. And my mother would have told me to let it go for the sake of the family, and the pieces would have kept disappearing. Instead, the truth had waited, patient as metal, until the one night it could stand in front of the one person who understood exactly what it meant. I have thought a great deal since then about how proof does not rescue you on its own. It waits for a witness who can read it. Ruth was that witness. My sister tried. Even then, I will give her that much. She said the pieces had been gifts from me, which they had not. She said we had always collaborated, which we never had. She said I was jealous, which landed differently now that the open ledger lay between us, in my own handwriting, with dates going back years before she claimed to have started designing anything. And then she made her final mistake, the one I think she will regret longest, because it was made in front of Ruth. She turned to the gallery owner and said, brightly, desperately, "You know how it is with family. There's always someone who wants to take the credit." And Ruth Aldermere looked at her with something that was almost, but not quite, pity, and said, "Yes, there usually is." And she turned, deliberately, away from my sister and toward me. "I own a gallery on Bell Street," Ruth said to me, as if we were the only two people at the party. And in the way that mattered, we were. I represent makers whose work I can stand behind. I can only stand behind work I can document, a maker I can name, a mark I can verify, a record I can trust. I've been looking for a silversmith for 2 years and finding only people who cast in bulk and call it handmade. She glanced at the display. At 11 years of my nights laid out on the velvet and back at me. "This is the real thing. I would like to talk to you." "Not tonight. Tonight belongs to your sister, in whatever way it still can. But soon. Will you come and see me?" And I said yes, in a voice I barely recognized. And she wrote her address on the back of my ledger's last page, above. An empty line, as if she knew I would want to record this too. I did not stay for the toast. There was no scene, no thrown glass, no crowd gasping. That is not how these things really end. The party simply went quiet in one corner and loud again everywhere else. And I gathered the pieces from the velvet table, my pieces, one by one into a soft cloth, and no one stopped me, because there was nothing anyone could say. My mother followed me to the door. I braced for her to defend Delia, the way she always had, to tell me to keep the peace, to remind me that family is family. Instead, she stood in the doorway, with her hands twisting together, and she said, in a small voice, "I didn't know, Marin. I truly didn't know." And I believed her, which was its own kind of grief, because it meant that for years she had looked at my work and never once thought it might be worth stealing. "I know you didn't," I said. And then, because I had promised myself in that room that I would stop being quiet, I said the other thing too. "But you called it a hobby for 11 years. Everyone did. That's part of how she got away with it. It's easier to steal from someone the whole family has agreed doesn't matter." My mother did not answer. She did not have an answer. She reached out and touched the cloth bundle in my arms, the little weight of all that silver. And she said, "Show me. Someday, show me how you do it." And I said I would, and I meant it, though it would take us a while to get there. Then I walked out into the cool night with my work in my arms and my ledger in my bag. And I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I had won, but because I had finally stood up. I wrote to Priya that week, the stranger whose message I had brushed off in the spring. I told her the truth this time, that the pendant she had bought was mine, that I had made it and stamped it, and that she had, without knowing it, been the first person to tell me what was happening. She wrote back a long, kind message. She said she had felt something was wrong at that craft market, that the seller could not answer a single question about the piece, could not say what the stone was or how the bezel was set, and had seemed almost annoyed to be asked. "I'm so glad it found its way back to its real maker," she wrote. "I'll treasure it even more now. I read that on my studio bench, under the same buzzing lamp, and I cried a little, the good kind, because a stranger had valued my work correctly before my own family ever had." Delia called me 11 days later. I remember the number because I am, after all, a woman who counts things. She did not apologize. Not really. She said things had gotten out of hand, which is the passive voice guilty. People love, as if the taking had happened on its own. As if my jewelry had wandered onto her velvet table by itself and signed her card in gold ink. She said the gallery thing had fallen through for her, which I already knew. And she said it as though I had done it to her. As though the ledger were a weapon I had chosen to bring, rather than a book I have carried for years. And then she asked, and I could hear her gathering the old charm around her like a coat, whether I might make a few pieces she could sell. Properly this time. Split the money. As if that were generosity. I thought about it longer than you might expect. Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to answer her honestly instead of angrily. Finally, I said, "No, Dealy, I'll make my own work, and I'll sell it under my own name. If you ever want to actually learn to make something, I'll teach you, the way I offered to teach Mom, but I won't hand you finished pieces to sign. Not ever again." She was quiet, and then she said, with the last of the charm curdling into something smaller, "You've changed." And I said, "No, I've just stopped apologizing for taking up space." I don't know if she understood it. I am not sure she wanted to. But I said it, and I hung up, and I did not feel cruel. I felt like a person who finally knew what her own hands were worth. I went to see Ruth on a Tuesday in the gray light of Gallery on Bell Street, and it was nothing like the party. Quiet white walls, good lighting, 4 other makers' work displayed like the serious objects they were. She made tea in a back room and asked to see my ledger properly. All of it. And she read through 11 years of my numbered lines the way some people read poetry, slowly, sometimes going back. "This is provenance," she said. "This is what half the makers I meet cannot give me. You could hand any piece you've ever made to a collector with its full history, its date, its mark, its record. Do you understand how rare that is?" And I said I had never thought of it as rare. I had thought of it as the least I owed the work. She looked at me over the ledger and said, "That's exactly why it's rare." Before I left, Ruth asked to see the steel stamp itself, the one I had cut by hand at 24. I keep it in a little tin in my bag, wrapped in cloth, because a maker's mark is the one tool you never leave behind. I unwrapped it and set it on the table between us, this small, worn punch of steel with my whole life carved into its tip. And Ruth picked it up carefully, the way you hold something that matters, and pressed it lightly against a scrap of soft metal she had on the bench. The little M and anvil bloomed up out of the surface, sharp and certain. "You made this yourself," she said. It was not a question. "I couldn't afford to buy one," I said. Ruth turned it over in her fingers and said, "The ones people buy are all the same. This one is only yours. No one on earth can fake this without your own hand." And she set it down between us like a small crown. I have thought about that sentence ever since. No one can fake this without your own hand. For 11 years, I had believed the mark protected the buyer, gave them proof of what they owned. I never understood that it protected me. My sister could take the finished pieces. She could take the credit, the compliments, the gallery owner's first attention, the whole warm room. But she could not take the thing that made them mine, because it lived in a place she never thought to look and could not have reproduced if she had. The proof was not in what everyone could see. It was in what only I had put there, quietly, alone, long before I needed it. That is the strange mercy of doing honest work in the dark. You are building a witness for a trial you do not yet know is coming. We agreed she would show a small collection of my pieces that autumn. She wanted me to keep my mark exactly as it was, the M, and the anvil, and to keep the ledger going, and she asked, almost shyly for a woman so composed, whether she could photograph a single page of it to display beside the work, so buyers could see that a real person with a real record stood behind each piece. I said yes. Standing in that clean, bright room, I understood something about the hidden mark I had been pressing into metal since I was 24, alone, with no gallery and no crowd, and no one calling me gifted. I had not done it for buyers. There were no buyers then. I had done it because I believed without any evidence and against everything my family told me that my work was real and deserved a signature. The mark was a message I had been sending to a future I could not see, and the future had finally opened it. The show sold well, though that is not really the point of this story. The point is smaller and quieter than a sold-out show. The point is a woman standing at a gallery opening, in a good dress, that fit her instead of one she wore to disappear, watching strangers turn her pieces over in their hands and find the little mark and smile at it. The point is, my mother, who came to the opening early and stood in front of the display for a long time without speaking, and then found me and said, "I called it a hobby. I'm sorry." It was never a hobby. The point is that Delia was not there, and her absence did not hurt the way I once thought it would, because I had stopped needing her to say the pieces were mine. The ledger said so. The mark said so. I said so. That was enough. People sometimes ask me now, at fairs and openings, why I sign my work in a place no one will ever see. They mean it as a small, friendly question, and I give them a small, friendly answer, usually something about tradition, and they nod and move on. But the true answer is longer, and it is the whole reason I have told you all of this tonight. I sign my work where no one can see because the signature was never for them. It was for the piece itself, and for the maker, and for the truth of the thing, which does not need an audience to be true. For 11 years, before anyone believed me, I told the metal who made it. And when the day came that I needed the metal to tell the truth back to a room full of people who had decided I did not matter, it did. Quietly. Exactly where I had left it. So if you have made something with your own hands, anything, a meal, a garden, a piece of writing, a repair, a child raised right, and someone with a warmer smile and a louder voice has stood up and called your work theirs. I want to tell you what I learned on the velvet in that bright, loud room. You do not have to shout to be believed. You do not have to ruin anyone. You only have to keep your record, keep your mark, keep the quiet proof of who you are in a place they will never think to look. Sign your work, even where no one will see it, especially where no one will see it. Because the truth is patient, and it keeps, and one day the right person will turn the thing over in the light. And there you will be, exactly where you always were. Thank you for listening.